Several great channels have made me see high-speed rail differently. But now I just need to see mathematical proof that the California high-speed rail will truly provide the cheapest method of travel while also having the lowest emissions. But I couldn't find any studies that did that. So I did the only sensible thing. Grabbed the business plan for the high-speed rail project, tracked down sources on costs for airplanes, gas, and electric cars, brewed a cup of tea, and spent some quality time in my happy place. Hi, I'm Nathan, someone who loves to just math stuff up. And this is Save Money, Save the Planet. Let's start with the airplanes. LAX boasts that San Francisco is one of their most flown-to destinations, and they fly around 1 million passengers there per year. Spending some time on a travel website tells us two things. The flight time for this trip is 1 hour and 25 minutes, and a very common aircraft used is the Boeing 737-800. This website didn't have the specs for a 737-800, but it did have them for a 737-700. It tells us that it costs about $8,200 in order to operate and maintain this aircraft for every hour of flight. So using these numbers, we find that the cost to fly a passenger from LA to SF is about $86.01. You may be wondering why I'm not using ticket prices. Well, just be patient. It'll all make sense soon. Now, the cost for a gasoline car is much easier to determine since the IRS works hard in order to know what the cost per mile of car ownership is. Their 2022 value for this was 65 cents per mile. So we can just multiply that by 382 miles, which is about how long the trip is. Now, in order to figure out the cost per passenger, we need to figure out how many people are in the car. For that, let's use the average household size in California, which is 2.8, but let's call it a nice round 3. Retired couples who want to visit their grandbaby, businessmen traveling alone for work, a single person traveling home for the holidays. Nah, none of those people exist in this world. We're gonna assume that every single car that makes this trip has exactly 3 people in it. As a result, our cost per traveler comes out to $82.77. Now, California has a plan to stop all sales of gasoline cars in 2035, so we should also do the math for an electric car. Whoa! So many of you rolled your eyes at that 2035 goal. I could feel it all the way over here. Well, try to be just a tad optimistic, because California recently released some of their initial legislation behind this, and it actually has teeth. They're planning to fine manufacturers $20,000 for every car short of the goal that they end up. Either manufacturers will end up with a non-profitable sale, or they'll beef up the price of gasoline cars in order to compensate, which will only make the electric cars more price competitive. Best legislation ever? Probably not. But it does make me optimistic that this plan could work. Back to the cost, though. Unfortunately, the IRS doesn't have cost per mile for electric cars, so I needed to create one based on the cost of my own electric car. My car is currently worth about $25,000, so a depreciation rate of 8% cost me $2,000 a year. So far, maintenance for tire rotations, inspections, brakes, all that jazz, is averaged out to about $300 per year. Electricity costs me about 4 cents per mile that I drive, and let's assume that I drive 15,000 miles a year, which means that I'll spend $600 on electricity. And finally, my insurance costs about $1,100 per year. All this means that my electric car costs about 27 cents per mile, but I'm a little worried that I might miss something, so let's just plan around 45 cents per mile, just to be safe. When we plug that into the same equations as for the gasoline car, we end up with a cost per passenger somewhere between $34.38 and $57.30. Okay, the time has come. High-speed rail. The 2022 business plan for this project says that they want to get 29.3 million passengers in 2040, and they expect that the high end of their operations and maintenance will cost $1,197 million. This means that the cost per passenger will be $40.85. This annual ridership may seem high at first glance, But remember that the high-speed rail will have stations in these counties which have these populations. That means that the business plan is assuming that everyone in these counties will use the high-speed rail 1.5 times a year, which is really just saying that they'll use it for one round trip. In fact, the business plan mentions that they might be able to get high-speed rail all the way up to 50 million, which is assuming that everyone in these counties uses the high-speed rail 2.7 times, which, honestly, still very doable. That's just 2 round trips a year. I could easily see myself visiting relatives twice in 1 year. So if we plug these numbers in, then the cost per rider goes down to $23.94. So this tells me 2 things. First, high-speed rail, even at low expectations, is less expensive than an airplane. This is good news since the business plan mentions that they plan to compete with air travel by offering tickets which are reliably 80% the price of airplane tickets. And when you account for the typical 45 minutes it takes to board a plane, and then 45 minutes to deboard, this results in a door-to-door trip which likely takes about the same amount of time while costing 20% less. So yeah, that'll definitely convince loads of people to travel this way instead of using an airplane. Meanwhile, the company will still be making an actual profit. A profit which we can reinvest in the system in order to open up more destinations in the future. What's that? Take it all the way up to Seattle? Ooh. Yes, please. My second takeaway is that the high-speed rail may very well have trouble competing with a car simply because the ticket prices will be more expensive than the cost of driving. In a way, this makes sense, because the main selling point of using high-speed rail versus driving is the fact that the trip ends up being significantly faster. It is interesting, however, that high-speed rail could compete if it wanted to. For instance, a round-trip Metrolink ticket from San Bernardino to Union Station typically costs about $20, but on the weekends, someone could take this trip for a paltry $10 instead. So if our state decided that they wanted to reduce car emissions by having steeply discounted train tickets available on big travel days, such as Thanksgiving, they could actually make train tickets cost less than traveling by car. Or think about how LA likes to do free transit days on Earth Day and Clean Air Days in order to try to get more people used to taking transit to work. High-speed rail could do something similar on select weekends, while not putting their profits in jeopardy. In addition, high-speed rail could create something similar to the LIFE program for low-income citizens, so that the high-speed rail system can be accessible to all citizens without jeopardizing its ability to pay for the cost of its own operation and maintenance. But would they want to do that? Would the emissions of the train truly be less than the emissions of other methods? Well, part 2 of the video exists in order to answer that exact question. So let's get into it. For plane travel, there's actually a really cool calculator from myclimate.org, and that tells us that this trip will produce 0.153 tons of CO2 or 153 kilograms. Since the average gasoline car emits 411 grams of CO2 per mile driven and the trip is 382 miles, then this means that doing the same car trip will result in 52.33 kilograms of CO2 per passenger. For the electric car, we can use a recent test of the Kia EV6, and that showed the car getting about 3.3 miles per kilowatt hour when driven at 70 miles per hour. And since California creates an average of 0.879 pounds of CO2 in order to create 1 kilowatt hour, we find that the electric car emits 15.4 kilograms of CO2 per passenger for this trip. Now, the high-speed rail was a little tricky. There are studies out there which give emissions per passenger kilometer of high-speed rail, but they all use Chinese data in order to figure this out. And China has a very different power grid from California. So instead, I tracked down this article, which told me that 3.8 kilowatt hours can give us 100 passenger kilometers. If I assume that we run our high-speed rail at 30% the capacity of China, so we only get 30 passenger kilometers for every 3.8 kilowatt hours, then this means that the emissions of our high-speed rail is 31.08 kilograms of CO2 per passenger. This is better than doing the drive alone in an electric car, but not as good as doing it with 2 or more passengers. But if we manage to run our high-speed rail at 70% the capacity of China's, then we end up with 13.3 kilograms of CO2 per passenger, which is better than doing the drive in an electric car with 3 total passengers. So it doesn't matter if you're talking about cost or carbon emissions. As far as I'm concerned, the answer remains the same. We need to push hard to build high-speed rail quickly and then get people using it as much as possible. If we manage to do this, then we truly will create a future where ticket prices can be lower than every other mode of transportation, and we'll have significantly less emissions. Even if the ticket prices never get quite as low as a car, you'll likely be okay with spending a couple extra bucks in order to get to your destination in a fraction of the time. Lord knows people are already willing to do that with airplanes. But man, it really would be nice to get where you're going fast and with low emissions, wouldn't it? Oh, and hey, if you didn't catch Alan Fisher's amazing video about why we shouldn't care how much building high-speed rail will cost, then click here. It's a playlist with videos on high-speed rail starting with, yeah, you guessed it, the video by Alan Fisher. Hopefully you find it useful. Alright, I'll be back again next month to talk about how noisy, well, actually quiet, trains are. See you then.